my aims and hopes for these sessions together is not to give a comprehensive Christian answer for every topic that we'll be looking at together. That's not possible in a 25-minute talk. My aim is also not to try and thoroughly convince the thoroughgoing skeptic of every claim that the Christians or the church makes. And as I've said before, that's partly because I'm not thoroughly convinced of every claim that the church makes. But what I am interested in is, I think, a much more humble ambition, and that is really just to create a better conversation between the church and culture. I'd like to create a better conversation between church and culture, and create a space where believers and skeptics can come together and discuss the big questions of life, the universe, and everything, as Douglas Adams called it, and just be able to pull stuff apart, put it back together, pull it apart again, and keep doing that, and see that as a healthy part of our lives together. So that's by way of a statement of purpose. So today the topic is science as the end of God. And I have to, first of all, give credit to my postgraduate supervisor back in Bristol, Ernest Lucas. Ernest Lucas has his PhD in biochemistry and his PhD in theology. He also reads French, German, Greek, Hebrew, and ancient Babylonian, which he taught himself while waiting for lab experiments to work at Oxford. And so he's just a real inspiration to be around a guy like that. And so much of what I'm going to share today has really been taken from and shaped by numerous conversations I've had personally with him and different classes and lectures that I've sat in on. So credit to Ernest Lucas, I'm very grateful to him. So let's get on with the topic, science as the end of God. The well-known Oxford biologist and very vocal atheist, part of what's known as a group as the New Atheists, Richard Dawkins, who we mentioned before, he describes the relationship between science and God like this. He says, God and science are competing or rival explanations for facts about life and the universe. Science and God are competing explanations for facts about the universe and life. Someone else has famously described the relationship between science and God as a fight between a warthog and a viper, and it is a fight to the death. And who is winning this death match? Well, Richard Dawkins is happy to tell us. He says faith is believing not just in spite of the evidence, but in the jaws of the evidence. I love that picture that he paints there. Faith is believing not just in spite of the evidence, but in the jaws of the evidence. Well, this is certainly one way that we can depict the relationship between science and faith. We can certainly do that. And for those Christians here this morning who don't like this picture of science and faith pitted against each other like this, we must first of all recognize that the church herself has often described the relationship in precisely these kinds of terms on numerous occasions, all too often. So, for example, in the 1600s, Galileo faces ecclesiastical wrath, and he is put under house arrest. Why? Because he presents the empirical evidence for the Copernican revolution, that radical idea that the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. Now, of course, we look back at that today and we think, what on earth why would the church take such a combative stance against Galileo, who was a Christian, by the way? Why would they do that? But I do have to wonder whether fundamentalist Christians today are putting us in a similar kind of predicament, as they have been particularly vocal here in the United States, at least, against the teaching of evolution in state-supported schools. Ironically, and this is one of those strange ironies of life, it's here that Richard Dawkins and his fundamentalist Christian counterparts actually find themselves in agreement on something, that they find some common ground here. They both seem to be utterly insensitive to the different types of literary genre that are in the Bible, and they insist on reading every literary genre in exactly the same way, that is, with a kind of wooden literalism. In other words, neither of them can read, but that's rude, so I won't say it. Here's a submission to the court in the United States by the Christian Creationist Research Society, and they say this: the student of nature, the account of origins in Genesis is a factual presentation of simple historical truths. Richard Dawkins, in his book The Blind Watchmaker, says something similar. He says Genesis is an alternative to the theory of natural selection. Well, there you go, isn't that nice? The two of them agree on something at last. The point is that Richard Dawkins and other atheists like him, and not all atheists are alike by any means, but Richard Dawkins and other atheists along that vein, are not entirely to blame for this picture of science and faith being at war with each other. All too often the churches, whether it's from Galileo and the Copernican Revolution or the 21st century creationists fighting the teaching of evolution in schools, the church has often perceived a very adversarial relationship between faith and science. Of course, what I want to do this morning is to reconsider the situation. I want to consider whether there is another way of conceiving of the relationship between science and faith. Now, I have to say I'm not a scientist. I'm not a scientist of any description, so I'm not about to start trying to argue for or against any particular scientific facts. Let's just say for now, the facts are the facts. And let's leave it there for now. But I am interested in the philosophical consequences of those facts. I'm interested in the intellectual history of those facts, how those facts have been interpreted, and how those interpretations of those facts have been put to use. And while we certainly can't come up with a comprehensive philosophy of science this morning, well, that's an entire field of study in itself, volumes have been written on it, we can't come up with a comprehensive philosophy of science this morning. I still think there are some important things we can say about what science does, and I think there are some important things we can say about what theology does and the relationship between the two. So that's what we're going to do, if that makes sense. We're going to let's start with theology. What does theology do? Then we'll ask, what does science do? And we'll see if we can bridge the gap, if there is a gap, or if that's even possible. So, what does theology do? First of all, I think it's very important to know the fact that the Christian doctrine of creation, the emphasis of that doctrine of creation, has been on defining the God-world relationship, the relationship between the Creator and the creation. So that when early Christian theologians said God created out of nothing, when they used that phrase, they weren't trying to say this is how God created the world and this is how the world works. They were simply trying to define the relationship between God and the world, the Creator and the creation, in explicitly theistic terms, over and against things like pantheism or dualism. So for example, pantheism says that God and the world are identical. God is the world. The world is God. If one were to cease to exist, so the other would also. Dualism, on the other hand, says, no, God and the world are not the same. They're separate. They're not identical. But the world has existed eternally alongside God. These are different ways of organizing the God-world relationship. Let's put it up on the screen for a second. Different ways of organizing and arranging the God-world relationship. And so when early Christian theologians use that phrase, God created out of nothing, well, they weren't trying to say this is how he created or how the world works. They were simply trying to define the God-world relationship in explicit theistic terms, which said, look, God and the world are not identical, they're separate, contra pantheism. But at the same time, the world has not existed alongside God eternally, because the world only exists because God chose to create it, contra dualism. So this is what theology does, at least the Christian doctrine of creation does. It emphasizes that God-world relationship. On the other hand, the questions of how the world was made, when the world was made, and how the world works, the Bible doesn't answer. In fact, the Bible doesn't even begin to ask or answer those kinds of questions and approach those questions. That is the domain of science. Now, sometimes this relationship between God and science, theology and science, is not always, the division of labor isn't always respected or recognized, that kind of delineation. So, for example, in an often quoted passage in his book, A Brief History of Time, Professor Stephen says that because his version of Big Bang cosmology, the Big Bang origins of the universe, because his version of the Big Bang cosmology removes any datable, identifiable beginning, therefore there is no creator God. Professor Stephen Hawkins seems to think that in order for there to be a creator God, there has to be an identifiable point in time, datable beginning. And if there isn't, then there's no room for God, which is an interesting assertion to make, seeing as this problem has been resolved by theologians in the 4th century. This is a quote from Professor Alistair McGrath. He's a biologist and also a theologian at Oxford, and he describes Augustine's position on this. He says, Augustine argued that God could not be considered to have brought the creation into being at a definite moment in time, as if time itself existed prior to creation. For Augustine, time itself must be seen as an aspect of the created order. Augustine then thus speaks of the creation of time, or creation with time, rather than creation in time. In other words, because time is part of the created order itself, it could well be, it's possible that God created time with precisely the characteristic that it has in Stephen Hawkins' cosmology. That it doesn't allow for an identifiable, it has that characteristic, it doesn't allow for an identifiable, datable beginning. This example illustrates the limits beyond which science cannot take us. Ernest Lucas describes it this way. He says, by its very nature, science deals with what theologians call secondary causes, that is, with interactions within nature. It cannot deal with primary causes, that is, the ultimate origin and purpose of nature. Let's give a couple more examples, and we'll keep this up on screen so we can kind of relate these examples to that. So one from cosmology, one from biology, one from the origins of the universe, one from the origins of life on Earth. Big Bang cosmologists claim to be able to give us an explanation for the origins of the universe in terms of a fluctuation in a quantum vacuum. Now, the quantum vacuum isn't nothing, it's a sort of energy field. Now, this is still an answer in terms, an explanation in terms of secondary causes, right? Interactions within nature, mechanisms of nature. This is still an answer. We're still left wondering why there is a quantum vacuum in the first place, and why would a fluctuation in a quantum vacuum produce an inflationary Big Bang and produce the world we are? As Professor Paul Davies has described it, he says, though science may explain the world, we still have to explain science. The laws which enable the universe to come into being spontaneously seem themselves to be the product of exceedingly ingenious design. The same thing that we've said for the origins of the universe might be said for the origins of life on Earth as well. Look, it could well be that one day chemistry, biology, molecular biology will one day give us a very satisfactory explanation as to how life on Earth or some other planet, given the right conditions, could emerge spontaneously through perfectly natural causes. Could do that one day. But we're still left wondering why impersonal, unconscious, non-intelligent, non-relational matter would give rise to personal, intelligent, relational, conscious beings like ourselves. We're still left with that question. If you remove a personal, relational, intelligent being, a God of sorts, a creator, out of the picture, what we're left with is a very long chain of secondary causes, but without any ultimate explanation. Now sometimes, as I've said, Christians often kind of just completely ignore this division of labour between theology and science. And what you end up with is sometimes, ironically, Christians start using the very same techniques that are used kind of to push God out, the same technique they use to try and create a space for God. So just as some atheists have said, look, we have a science for this, and we have scientific explanations for that, and we have science for this over here, therefore we don't need God as an explanation. Many Christians have turned around and said, but we don't have science for this, and we don't have a scientific explanation for that, therefore it must be God. God is the answer. That's what they fall back on. This is what's known as the God of the gaps argument. In other words, God lives in the gaps of our knowledge, our scientific knowledge. But what happens when we come up with a scientific explanation for said phenomena? Then what? Well, the space for God begins to shrink. And the more we fill in the gaps of our scientific knowledge, which is a daily, no, an hourly occurrence, the smaller the space for God becomes. If you go to the American Museum of Natural History, have any of you sat in the planetarium? Have you done it? It's great. I really love it. Right now they've got, or they did a couple of months ago at least, have this really good show with, which is on dark matter. And if you go there, you'll hear Neil deGrasse Tyson say this. He says 95% of matter and energy in the known universe is not empirically observable. It's dark matter and dark energy, and we just don't know what that is. And yet it seems to be guiding the destiny of the universe. Phew, for now there seems to be a very large space for God to exist in. But what happens when tomorrow scientists come up with, and again close, a way of really observing this dark matter and understand exactly what it is and how it works? What then? Does the space for God shrink by 95%? You see, if people argue for the God of the gaps, as if he were like some sort of fairy or Santa Claus or something along those lines, then yes, the space for God shrinks by 95%. That's what you get. Well, let me summarize what I've been trying to say so far. I've been trying to argue that science and faith are perfectly compatible as long as we recognize the different levels at which science and theology operate and the constraints that puts on both disciplines. For those of you who feel that what I've said so far has been a little bit too abstract, I hope to make it a little bit more concrete with a parable that Ernest Lucas tells. I'll read it to you. He says, it was a warm summer evening. Two people were walking along the beach, listening to the gentle lapping of the waves and looking at the star-studded sky. They both spotted a light flashing out at sea. One of them was a professor of physics, the kind of scientist who thought of nothing but his work. Science was his life. He rushed to his car, where, being the sort of person he was, he kept all kinds of scientific equipment. He got out a stopwatch and timed the flashes. He got out a photometer and measured the brightness of the flashes. He set up a spectrometer and recorded their spectrum. He noted the position of the light against the background stars. As he drove home along the coastal road, he stopped a couple of times and noted its position again, as it seemed to be moving against the background stars. And he did some triangulation calculations on his laptop. When he got home, his wife said, "You look excited, dear. Did you see something interesting tonight?" "Yes," he said. "I saw what I deduced was a heated tungsten filament enclosed in a silica envelope emitting a regular pattern of flashes of visible radiation at an intensity of 2,500 lumens from a distance of about 850 meters offshore." The other person on the beach that night was a teenager going home from Sea Scouts. When she got home, her mother said, "You look excited, dear. Did you see something interesting tonight?" "Yes," she said. "I saw a boat signaling SOS. I phoned the Coast Guard and they sent out the lifeboat." This parable illustrates the fact that the same event may have more than one level of explanation. The same phenomenon, the same event, may have more than one level of legitimate explanation. Science, by its very methods, is a study of matter and energy. Therefore, all of its explanations are going to be expressed in materialistic terms. That's what science is. That's what science does. That's why it's so good at describing the mechanisms within nature. In the parable, the light. But it can't take us back behind the light and answer questions of meaning and purpose. That is, in the parable, getting behind the light to the mind of the person operating it and the message they wanted to communicate. Right? So science can take us as far back as the tungsten element, the secondary cause, but it can't take us back behind the light to the person using it, the primary cause. So science is never going to come up with the answer God. It is also never going to come up with the answer there is no God, because that's the wrong tool for answering these kinds of curious metaphysical questions. It just is. And we can't get mad with science for not answering all of our metaphysical questions. But while science cannot answer our metaphysical questions, I think science does and is prompting a lot of metaphysical questioning in the scientific community amongst theists, atheists and agnostics alike. For example, one of the reasons is because of the number of fantastic coincidences, or sometimes known as fine-tuning, the amount of fine-tuning, the amount of fantastic coincidences needed in order for intelligent, conscious, personal, relational beings like ourselves to emerge in this universe. One great example of this is what's known as the cosmological constant. The cosmological constant is apparently a kind of anti-gravity that causes the universe to expand. Now, if this anti-gravity, this cosmological constant, were off by just a fraction, then galaxies wouldn't be able to form. Everything would kind of fall apart from each other. Galaxies wouldn't form, stars wouldn't be able to form, even small aggregates of matter would not be able to form. And that's just if it was off by a fraction. So, to get a kind of feel for what this means intuitively, imagine that there is a dartboard the size of the galaxy, spanning the entire breadth of the galaxy. And on this dartboard there was a target, not a mile wide, not a foot wide, but an inch in diameter. Actually, it's a bit less than that, but let's be generous, call it an inch. The kind of fine-tuning necessary to have the cosmological constant the way it is the equivalent of someone taking a dart and throwing it randomly at this dartboard and hitting it right on the bullseye, on that target. Now, this is a fantastic coincidence. Maybe that's tolerable. Maybe we could tolerate another. But what isn't tolerable is a mounting number of these kinds of fantastic coincidences. What isn't tolerable, you can have one, but you can't have a great long list of them, not without provoking some interesting metaphysical questioning. By the way, this is actually why the late Christopher Hitchens, which I think it was a terrible loss for all of us when he passed, he always made the debate very interesting and lively. Christopher Hitchens, when asked, what do you think the strongest argument is from the other side, he said that most of us atheists, he said, will point to the fine-tuning argument. He said, this is not trivial, he said. This actually takes some work. So, how are people working at this? Well, there's various responses, of course. One of the ways that we can respond to this is to just kind of shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's just happenstance, right? It just is what it is. It's just the way things happen to be. It's the way things are. It is what it's happenstance. Of course, many people find this increasingly untenable or deeply unsatisfying. That's because it's a little bit like me standing. Let's say you stood in front of a firing squad, and this is a trained, marksman. They never miss their mark, and they take not just one shot, but they take shot after shot after shot, and every single shot misses you. Now, yes, of course, you can take off your blindfold and shrug your shoulders and go, well, of course they all miss me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here to observe it, would I, dummy? Right? I mean, you can say that, of course you can. But wouldn't you be curious as to wonder why? I think that's a reasonable question, and many scientists, atheists, agnostics, theists are asking this kind of question. Why? Now, another response would be to say, there's a creator God. This God is intelligent. He's created the universe, but then, of course, if you take up this position, you have to give up your atheistic or agnostic position. So the third option, of course, is this, the multiverse. The multiverse is this idea that our universe is not unique. It is not the only universe. There are multiple other universes, an infinite number of universes maybe, with an infinite number of arrangements of the way things are. Now, the beautiful thing about the multiverse is it may give us a way of explaining why the universe looks so finely tuned, so carefully, like a setup job, as someone said. Why it looks so finely tuned, but without having to refer to some sort of fine-tuner, some intelligent being, some creator. You see, the universe only looks finely tuned because you think it's unique. You think it's the only universe. But what if there are multiple universes? What if there are an infinite number of universes? Then what you've done is increase the probabilistic chance of there being a universe like this. In other words, that there was bound to be one of these, because there's one of all the others, isn't there? Let me illustrate this for you. If I take a die and I roll it 6 times, and only 6 times, no more than 6 times, and every single time it lands on 6 sixes in a row, you're going to look at me very suspiciously, right? You're going to. I'm not gambling with you, Stephen, because this is a loaded die, and we've got to change that out. I'm not going to do it. But what if I were to roll the die 1,000,000 times? right, if we had that time. And somewhere in the million throws, we got 6 sixes in a row. Now you're going to shrug your shoulders. It's not suspicious. It's not a loaded die. It's like, yeah, well, of course, you increase the probabilistic chance of that happening. It was bound to. And that's essentially what's being said. There's bound to be one of these universes because there's one of all the others where life didn't emerge and there is no intelligence, etc., etc. It's bound to be one of these because it's one of all the others. This is a fascinating concept. And I do love all the sci-fi shows which actually look into the possibilities of what happens when we meet one of these parallel universes and the multiverse and engage with that. I love those shows. But let's be very, very clear about it. It's an interesting concept, it's a possibility, of course, but let's be very clear. This is well beyond the reach of empirical verification. Well beyond the reach. And when atheism starts to hang out there and shelter there, I can't help thinking that it sounds suspiciously like the God of the gaps argument, only in reverse. I can sustain my view of a godless universe here. I can sustain my view of my atheism here because this is of this other thing which is not empirically verifiable at all. It's atheism of the gaps. Now, I know many Christians have used precisely this kind of reasoning to try and create a space for God. But after everything we've said this morning, I can't with good conscience recommend it.